Hello students, my name is Shreya. I teach English literature and my specialization is in the parts of literary theory and criticism. So now literary theory and criticism has become like a field where most students are scared of it and tend to not understand the importance, as well as they are not able to tackle this portion as well, right? So we're going to today look at, and this is going to be a part series where I'm going to cover all important theories of literary theory and criticism, which is often the subject of your major exams, right? So I'm going to cover these theories not just in a subjective manner but also in an objective fashion, right? So it helps you not just to clear the objective kind of questions but also write a subjective answer based on these theories. So it could also help you in your home examinations. So now this is going to be a part lecture series, like I told you, where I'm going to be covering important theories as well as criticism, right? Now, the first question that arises, that what is the difference between theory and criticism? What are these words? Why are they presented in a different fashion? Now, if you know some people who've written about theory, there is this individual called John Hopkins. And he's written a text called Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism. Where he tends to use the words interchangeably, right? He's used theory and criticism as words that are interchangeable. But my favorite example of the difference that you can make, and my favorite way of explaining the difference, which I often use in my classrooms as well, is a text which is called Text and Context. Right? And it's a text by Stephen Lynn. And what does he say? And as much as I would want myself to be the idea behind the analogy that I'm going to give you, he gives the analogy where he says literature can be compared to travel, right? So he says literature is like traveling, right? So when you travel, literature is equal to travel, he says. Now, how does he compare literature to travel? He says, like, you read a book of literature and you read a text, and through the text, you travel vicariously. You live vicariously through the text, right? So he says literature can be so compared to travel. Now, what is theory and what is criticism here? He says the various theories act like tour agencies for you. They act like tour agencies. Now, what does that mean? He says theories are various tour agencies and criticism is a tour guide. Right? So now there are various tour agencies that are available. So any city that you go to, so for example, if you go to Italy, if you go to the country Italy and you visit Venice, right? Venice is also believed, it has beautiful architecture, but it's also believed to be a fashion. It's important for fashion as well. So it's also kind of a fashion capital. So if you visit Italy and you go to Venice, there are going to be various agencies that are going to provide you the kind that takes you through all the historical places and takes you to all the architectural places, and there is going to be the other which is going to take you to, say, popular boutiques or say popular fashion stores, right? So these are two kind of tour agencies that you can take, right? Now these tour agencies would give you would provide you a tour guide, right? They would provide you a tour guide who would help you see the city as you do, right? So what to see, where to go, what to find there are all the things that you can experience, right? So it's essentially the same city. So two people are going essentially to the same city called Venice. But what will they do? The idea that they take from there is going to be very different. The perspectives that they come out from after visiting Venice are going to be very different, right? Similarly, so if you take a text of Shakespeare, say you take Hamlet, right? And if you look at a psychoanalytic criticism of Hamlet, right? If you look at the psychoanalytic criticism, what would you do? You would look at the interiority of the characters. You would try and look at the interiority of the characters. So if you look at the psychoanalytic theory and you go on to psychoanalytically criticize Hamlet, you're going to look at the various aspects of the character's mind and try and understand the pertinent question about Hamlet as to why was the action delayed through a psychoanalytic reading. So you would perhaps focus on the Oedipus angle. You would perhaps focus on the Oedipus angle between Gertrude and Hamlet, right? So you use theory, the psychoanalytic theory, which was given to you by Freud and Lacan and Jung, through which they teach you various aspects of the mind and functioning, and you put that in your text called Hamlet, and then you criticize the text psychoanalytically, right? Had this been a feminist criticism, what would you do? You would take your feminist theory. You would look at your Julia Kristeva, or you would look at Irigaray, or you would look at Butler, and then you would take the ideas from those theories, Showalter, Gilbert and Guvar, and you would take all those ideas and put them in a feminist criticism, right? So this is a basic difference between theory and criticism, where you use a particular theory to criticize a text, and that is going to be your perspective of looking at the text from henceforth, right? So whenever you look at a text from, say, like I told you, a post-colonial theory, you take post-colonial theory and you try and criticize a text through post-colonial theory, that is going to be the aspects that you're going to focus on, right? So now we're going to look at some of the important literary theories and how are those theories used to criticize. Right? Very important, and I make sure that I tell these to my students in the classroom also, that any theory that you look at, you understand the theory as is, but it's often very difficult to understand that how you're going to use it as a criticism. So what I also tend to do is give them topics, or give them, say, essay topics as to what they can write when they're new critiquing a text, or they are they're using formalism to critique a text, right? So I give them titles, so that helps them create a better picture as to what is the difference between theory and criticism, and how does one use a theory to criticize a text, right? Now moving on to the first one we're going to do here. It's called new criticism, right? Now new criticism, like it says, starts in the middle decades of 20th century America, right? Just a brief idea about when the movement started, what is the political condition, gives you a better perspective as to where you can put the theory in, and why do you think it started, right? So whenever we look at your literary movements, or whenever you look at neoclassical movement moving to romanticism, the tendency is to look why, right? Why did people talking about rationality suddenly change to talking about emotions? Right? What was the trigger? Why did a change happen? What triggered the change, right? So it's always important to look at when a certain theory is happening to put it in a historical perspective. But as I say this, it becomes an ironical statement, because the new critics precisely didn't want you to do that, right? So what do the new critics say? Right? It's a very important question for every theory, and I'll keep going back to how I teach in the classroom, because this is what I tell them. For every theory, find a what. What is feminism trying to say? 100 things. But just that one thing that encompasses it. What is new criticism trying to say? 100 things. But figure out that one thing, and it will make more sense when you go back to reading more hefty books on new criticism. And whatever ideas then you come across, right? So if, for instance, you come across the idea of heresy of paraphrase, then you put it into the idea of new criticism and understand how that fits in. Right? I'm going to explain this term. It's an important term related to new criticism. Right? So what is new criticism? So new critics say, look at the text in terms of only the text. Right? What does that mean? Don't look at anything that is outside the text. Don't look at the author. Don't look at the autobiography of the author. Don't look at the year the text is written in. Don't look at what it makes the reader feel. But only and only look at what is being said in the text. Now, if you look at what is being said in the text, what do you look at? You look at the form. Yeah? You look at the form of the text. You focus on form more than the content of the text, right? You focus on how the words are used. You focused on the kind of words that are used. If it's a poetry, you focus on the rhyme scheme of the poetry, right? If it's about, if the rhyme scheme that is used is regular, then the theme also is perhaps a regular theme. If it's a doggerel verse, then you go back and look at what does a doggerel verse mean, and why do you think a doggerel verse is used? Then you find tensions in the text, right? You look at tensions in the text. And a good text, according to new critics, is the one where all these tensions reach a resolution, right? All these tensions are met by a resolution. Okay? Now, I'll explain this further through some of the important concepts that have been given by new critics. right? So let's start with how did the word come up, right? Who was the first person who came out with the word called new criticism, right? So new criticism, the word itself comes from the book written by John Crowe Ransom, and the book is of the same name. So new criticism is a word by John Crowe Ransom, and he also gives a term called close reading, right? So again, for all the theories, it's important for you to know the people who are associated, know when it started, to understand a basic historical context, to know the people that are associated, to know their important works, and to remember the important fundamental terms that are associated with a particular theory. So for instance, I talk to you about close reading. So what is close reading? Close reading is a detailed analysis of a text. Pay close attention to every single word, every variant of the meaning that is possible, and go beyond what seems to be the obvious meaning, right? So read a text as closely as possible. Don't just go through a text. Look at the words, look at the how the words are arranged, look at the nature of the words. Are these words still in use? Are these words used by common people? Are these words that would only be used by somebody who's known, who's had a close encounter with language and who understands language very well? Who uses these words? How are these words used? How are these words placed? Right? So all these things would constitute your close reading. Right? Simple term, but very important. Then there is Klee and Brooks. Klee and Brooks, two texts that you need to know. There's the Well-Wrought On and the Understanding Poetry. Important texts again, but more important than that is the term that he's given. It's called the Heresy of Paraphrase. Now, what does this term mean? Now, all of us have a tendency. Whenever you are asked, for instance, in an exam question, in a literature exam, you're asked, and this I'm talking about like a subjective and not an objective question paper. So for your university exams, when you're asked a question on, say, the rape of the lock, right? And the question talks of the use of supernatural elements, right? What is the tendency? Our tendency is to first start with a summary. Right? We do start with a summary, and all of us, as much as we would want to deny, some of us take 3 pages if we don't know the answer, but some of us do, even if it's in a paragraph, we try and summarize the text. In fact, some of our professors also have always told us to begin with a summary so that you provide a grounding, right? But that is what Klee and Brooks says. He says the idea that interpretation of a text is incomplete without its paraphrasing is a problem, right? It's an idea that's a problem. The fact that you will always need a summary of a text to provide an interpretation of a text is a problem, which he calls the heresy of paraphrase, right? Now there's Ellen Tate. Ellen Tate has written 4 decades of poetry. There are also important works that he's written, but his important concept is the tension. So like I told you, when you look at all these words, what is the intention behind looking all the words and finding the meanings of the word and finding problems in a text through the words only? The idea is to find tension in a text and to reach a space of resolution. Look for tensions and then understand what brings together unity. How is the tension resolved? How is the tension resolved is your question, right? How do you resolve the tension at the end, right? Then there's I.A. Richards, who's written Practical Criticism. An important, he's also written, it's an important book that's associated with New Criticism, but remember that New Criticism, through his work, also came to be known as Practical Criticism. So if there's another word for New Criticism that you have to provide, it's actually Practical Criticism. Right, so moving on to some other people who are associated. There's Robert Penn Warren, not very important in terms of the text, but again an important name. He's actually a poet, so there are more poems that he's written, but again an important figure associated because he's an acknowledged poet, so we need to know his name as well, right? There's T.S. Eliot. Now T.S. Eliot is somebody who really does believe in this theory, right? He says, and that is the reason why he does not like Milton and Shelley. So it's a question that you've encountered somewhere, that T.S. Eliot did not really like Milton and Shelley. This is P.B. Shelley and this is John Milton, right? And he was really fond of metaphysical poets. And why is that? Because metaphysical poets kept their emotions and personal lives divorced from the text. Right? There was no relationship between their personal life and the text that they were writing. But is that the same for John Milton and P.B. Shelley? Not at all. Their texts were loaded with things that they were feeling in their real lives, right? So he's really fond of metaphysical poets for that reason, and he does feel that literary criticism is always been something that's not been very systematic. And if you start looking at words and only the words itself or the work itself, you would tend to make it more systemized, and he's in complete favor of making it systematic. However, he also calls literary criticism lemon squeezer school of criticism, where to the extent of looking at each word and finding meaning in each word, he says it's too exhaustive, and so it's not possible, right? Now there are these two gentlemen, Wimsatt and Beardsley. They've written collaborative works. Wimsatt and Beardsley have also written collaborative works along with I.A. Richards, right? Now there are two terms that are very important are intentional fallacy and affective fallacy. Right? So what is intentional fallacy? Intentional fallacy is your reading of a text should not depend upon what the intention of the author is. Right? It should not depend on author's intention, because even if the first thing is all the authors do not write a preface, right? So how do you know somebody's intention? Through the preface. So all the authors do not write a preface. Secondly, even if they've written a preface, how do you know it's true? How do you know it's true? How do you know it's true? Because an author when writes, there is also the commercial aspect, right? The author wants to sell the text. And that's why when your William Wordsworth, the text came out in 1798. So your lyrical ballads came out in 1798, but the first preface was written in 1818 and then in 1802. Why is that? Because he said, and this is precisely what he says, that I don't want to write a preface so that it seems like an agenda for people to buy my text, right? So that's the thing that could occur. So why do you trust a preface so much? It could just be an agenda to sell the text, and most people don't write a text. No, most authors don't write a preface. So then what do? Do you go back to the author's autobiography? Do you trace elements where they perhaps don't exist, right? And then there is the second one, which is known as the affective fallacy. You should also not focus on what the reader feels. What is the effect that the text has on a reader in order to determine what? In order to determine your understanding or your reading of the text, right? So these are some important words: heresy of paraphrase, close reading, affective fallacy, intentional fallacy, right? These are important terms that make an important understanding. Tension, Allen Tate's tension, right? And then there's William Emerson's 7 types of ambiguity. He is trying to understand the multiplicity of language in terms of understanding the various ways in which a word could be represented and its ambiguity in representation, right? So these are your important new critics, and this is a brief idea, and this is just a brief idea of your new criticism. Moving on now to Russian formalism. Now, Russian formalism is very similar to what I just taught you in new criticism, right? The ideas are extremely similar, okay? Starts in early 20th century Russia. So it's a theory that originates in Russia, and it's very importantly around those regions only, right? Now, there are two groups that are believed to be, and these are the areas that Russian formalism was spread in is Moscow and St. Petersburg. Right? So Russian formalism in areas of Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? And there are two literary circuits which are believed to be the foundation of your Russian formalism. There is the Prague literary circuit, which is Roman Jakobson, Rene Velik, and Jan Mukarovsky. And there is the Leningrad group or the Opoyaz group, which is important for an objective type of question paper, where Roman Jakobson's modern Russian poetry, Victor Slovatsky's On the Theory of Prose, and Boris Ichenbaum. These are three important figures, right? Now, Russian formalism, exactly like New Criticism, talks of keeping the text within the text, right? So, understanding of the text should be within the text. The text in itself is complete. You don't need to look outside at anything. You don't need to go beyond. You don't need to figure out anything else, right? A text is a web where all little pieces are working together to create meaning. So you don't need the author's intention. You don't need to look at the author's autobiography to find that, because then that's another text altogether, and for that text you have to look at that as a web of meanings and find their meaning there, right? So what is your text? Your text is complete. It's a small complex web of meanings where you have to look at the text and find meanings in all these intersections, and this intersection is tension, right? And then how is this tension resolved? Right, by finding unity. That how is this tension resolved is through unity, right? So these are your ideas that are talked of in New Criticism, are exactly ideas that are talked of in Russian formalism also. But there are two things that I wanted to discuss here, which is the idea of defamiliarization, which was given by Victor Slovatsky, and fabula versus use-it contrast, right? So Victor Slovatsky talks of the idea of defamiliarization, which is essentially when you just look at a text and there is nothing more and beyond that you know about the text, and you look at the form of the text, right? When you look at the form of this text, you understand that if it follows this particular set pattern, there is a idea of association, right? The idea of association. If a text is exactly in the form that you've been equipped to see a text in, there is the association that you feel. But if the text tends to take a form that is experimental, there is a defamiliarization. And how does defamiliarization helps? It helps you question, right? This is the same idea as Lyotard in his essay answering the question what is postmodern, focusing on the fact that one must focus on experimentation, and didn't understand people's obsession with having realist texts. Or this is the same idea that Brecht had when he was talking about alienation, and how the alienation effect creates a fourth wall, and how it breaks the familiarization that happens between the audience and the actors. It breaks that. And how does it help in furthering your insight and furthering your questioning nature and your mind, right? So that is the idea of defamiliarization that he talks of. Now there is also the contrast between fabula and use-it. So fabula here is the story, whereas use-it is the plot, right? So what is a story? A story is the chronological sequence of events. So how are A, B and C arranged? And what is a plot then? A story is A after B after C after D. So story is the story itself. So how is everything happening is your story. But what is the plot? Plot is how is the text arranged. So does A follow B and B follow C, or does C come before A and B, right? So all of these, so your shadow lines, Amitav Ghosh shadow lines, which is in retrospect, where he constantly goes back and comes forth, right? It's when you try and understand the writing scheme, it becomes your use-it, right? How is this text arranged? How is the story told? What is the narrative voice like? What are the aspects that the narrator is focusing on? What are the aspects that the narrator is hiding from us, right? So all these aspects. And so this is all about Russian formalism. So when you do a formalist analysis, what do? How do you use the theory in criticism? When you do a formalist analysis of a text, you focus on the text itself and the devices that the text is made up of, and understanding the devices and the way it creates a problem and then reaches a resolution, right?